With me tonight to discuss one of the darkest days in U.S. history and where we go from here is immediate past president of the National Bar Association, attorney C.K. Hoffler, and W. Mondale Robinson, the founder of the Black Male Voter Project. Glad to have you both on. Listen, 1 year ago today, we all watched in complete disbelief as Trump supporters stormed the Capitol in one of the worst attacks on our democracy, something unprecedented in U.S. history. C.K., what went through your mind as you saw the events of January 6th unfold?
First of all, Happy New Year. What went through my mind was that we were witnessing an attempted coup d'etat, a takeover of our government. And quite frankly, what was going through my mind was that they might succeed. It seemed as though there was inadequate security, inadequate officers to combat or to hold back the crowds that were angry, that were armed, and that obviously had some type of entree into the Capitol because I lived in Washington. I used to lobby. There's no way that you can simply storm the Capitol with any measure of security, especially not now, especially after 9/11. And so I felt that instantly that there was complicity on a lot of levels, and I really was concerned that they might succeed. And that was very frightening. When I compared or juxtaposed that to some Black Lives Matter marches where there were thousands of armed security trying to ensure that the angry mobs of Black and brown and white people combined, a rainbow coalition, if you will, didn't get out of hand versus the very few people that were here trying to tame this mob. It was very scary. It was a difficult moment, a dark moment, a cloud over this country that, frankly, I don't think that has lifted at this point.
Definitely an obvious racial disparity in the way that both were handled. Mondale, your reaction to what was happening that day?
I mean, I was down the street. I live in the area. I live in the DMV, and I think what happened is, for me, is I remember what stuck out of my mind very vividly was the white gentleman carrying a Marine Corps flag. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, and I've seen him swinging this flag, rushing the Capitol, not to defend democracy, not to defend the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, which is what the EGA, the Marine Corps symbol, stands for, but instead to defend white supremacy. And I think we missed a golden opportunity when we don't point out the fact that what happened on January 6th was white supremacy, not born in Trump, but given its fresh air and legs in this capacity from Donald Trump, past president. And I think what bothered me the most was something related to what CK said, but not just that. The idea that, these people were storming the Capitol, and I hear people saying, well, they didn't have guns or weapons of mass destruction. But in actuality, they did. I mean, armed with anger, intent, bear spray, holes, and taking the the police guns, made for a Molotov cocktail without fire. These people were intent on hanging the vice president, the one that was current and also the one that had just got elected, talking about then Senator Kamala Harris. And I think what happened is we play down this when we don't call it what it is. And I think coup d'etat is a language we should use and not just reserve it for Black and brown nations when things like this happen.
Absolutely. Some even had zip ties. Earlier today now, guys, President Biden spoke about the insurrection and didn't mince words. He rebuked the former president, that's how he referred to him, never once saying his name, for his role in the riots. Take a listen.
For the first time in our history, a president had not just lost an election, he tried to prevent the peaceful transfer of power as a violent mob breached the Capitol. But they failed.
Mondale, back to you. Biden generally doesn't give much time and energy to Trump, but today he had the time. Was it important for the president to go as hard as he did, calling out the lies that essentially was the basis for Trump supporters' Stop the Steal movement, especially since we're seeing so many attempts made by Republicans across this country to suppress the vote?
I think he was, for me, he didn't go far enough. I think not calling Trump name kind of lets him off a little bit. I think this is how white men disrespectfully disagree with each other. And I think we're in a moment and a time where you cannot allow any respect or give any respect to that creature named Donald Trump. He's in the process of dismantling democracy in this country in a way that people haven't seen before. We have a space but we have been downgraded ever since this election in 2016, when he thought, from between the time when the election results came out to when he was announced his victory, he was talking trash about what the election results was and how Hillary Clinton had stolen it, because he believed that he had lost the election. And we were downgraded as a democracy in 2016 in a way that we had never been, by organizations that monitor democracies around the world. And then after he lost and continued or started the big lie and has continued it, we've been downgraded even more, to the point where we are on par with Central and South American countries who have dictators and military coups that recently happened. So I think right now, Joe Biden had to say that because of the climate we find ourselves in. I'm absolutely glad he did. I think there was more he had to say, like Joe Manchin, get in line before you be on the same side as Donald Trump, because there's another attempt to steal our democracy that's happened that's not related to January 6th, but it's still an attempt, and that's the lack of action by Democrats like Sinema and Joe Manchin.
CK, given the attempts to suppress the vote, do you agree with Mondale that Biden didn't go far enough today?
Well, I think he could have gone further, but I think he was in keeping with the way that he governs his country. But I think that he could have gone further, and my humble impression, because we have to call it how we see it. This was an attempted coup d'etat. It failed, but it just barely failed. So I think it was important for Biden to send a message, a strong message, because, by the way, there were reports that there was going to be another insurrection attempted right now, today. And so somehow that didn't happen, but he had to send a message that this has got to stop. We've got to get back to democracy, governing this country. And I think he did send a strong message in his way. I didn't expect him to go any further than he went. I would have liked him to have gone further, but I didn't necessarily expect it. And he did convey that message in his way.
So 1 year later, the country is still divided on what they think happened that day. A poll by the Washington Post found 19% of Americans believe the rioters were mostly peaceful. 34% believe that citizens can be justified in taking violent action against the government, and many of those same people still believe that Biden's election wasn't legitimate. Are we surprised by these results? Mondale?
Not one bit. I wish that this poll, this UMD, University of Maryland, and also Washington poll would have went further and broke it down by partisan, and we would have seen that white Republicans believe that they're being robbed of something. This is on par with how white men are feeling right now. They feel like they're being robbed, and in some cases, white women, of what is rightfully theirs, and what they believe is rightfully theirs is to rule America in a way that's beneficial to white supremacy. We must say that we as a country say we don't have a standard language or a standard religion, but we do, and it's white supremacy. And I think when people say things like, we need to make America great again, or get back to when democracy was great, there was never a point when America's democracy was fuller than it is right now. And I think we're obligated to tell the truth that what's happening right now is a direct result of white people feeling like they're losing power. And it's because they're becoming a smaller fraction of the government, and their will, even when 72 million of them vote for a racist like Donald Trump, they still aren't enough to outpower the majority of this country, which are progressive white folk, black and brown voters, and mostly millennials and the generation behind them, and a little bit of my generation.
All right, you two stick around. We've got more Making the Case after the break. Tonight, we're taking a look back on one of the darkest moments in American history, the Capitol insurrection. Still with me is CK Hoffler, immediate past president of the National Bar Association, and W. Mondale Robinson, founder of the Black Male Voter Project. Guys, the Department of Justice has now had an entire year to investigate what went down at the Capitol, but AG Merrick Garland has been criticized for not being aggressive enough. CK, are those criticisms warranted?
I think that the Justice Department has been fairly aggressive. I just personally would like to have more information and see more arrests and have more details on the types of investigations that have happened and some of the results. I think that's why people are very critical, because they just don't know all of the level of detail on what's happened with the investigation and what the plan is going forward. People clearly know that you can connect the dots to the former president of the United States, his son, Rudy Giuliani, and others who are high-placed officials. And so people want to know, are they going to be held accountable? Or are we just going to have the people who are out there protesting held accountable? Is there going to be a path to former President Trump, to his son, to Rudy Giuliani, to a number of other people? There had to be some complicity within the Capitol. What's going to happen? And I think that's why there's criticism. But I do believe the Justice Department has taken this very seriously, has done a number of things, but the communication to the public, to the people, has not been adequate. And so, of course, people want to see more, because this is one of the worst things that's ever happened in the history of this country. So people are very anxious about this because it could happen again. After all, over 70 million people voted for former President Trump. That's the reality. This was just a small segment of those people that were protesting. And when they're saying, when former President Trump said those people, I want people to think about, who were those people? Oh, I think those people were us people right now on this show, as well as other Black and brown people, Democrats, progressives, young folks that voted, and that all of the people that supported Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We're all those people. And so I think that that's significant.
Mondale, CK brings up a really good point. I mean, so far the DOJ has only gone after those who physically breached the Capitol on January 6th, but many want people to, or the DOJ, to go after those who weren't there but played a role in what occurred, namely Trump. He is yet to face any real consequences for anything. I mean, he's a Teflon Don when it comes to accountability. Is it likely that he'll have to account for the part that he played in all of this?
I think, I don't make it my business to defend large white institutions like the Department of Justice, but I think in Garland's defense, he said something that was extremely important for people to believe and understand. I went to law school, did not take anybody's bar, so I don't plan to play lawyer on TV tonight. But I will say that when he said, when you're doing trials, when you're building out large trials like this, it's important to start with those that are easy to get out of the way, so they don't jam up the court for those that are harder and longer trials that are to come. So, and thinking about this, and if we're listening to some of the words of the Attorney General, he was also saying that everybody, those present and also had any role in this, will be held accountable, which leads us to believe that there are other factors that have things coming down the pipeline. And I hope they are. I'm surprised that we haven't seen sedition or any felon or felonious murder charges, because it seems like this would have been a charge since we lost 7 people. Even the processor that died, I feel like everybody that was tried for felony charge had felonious murder attached to that, because when you're in an act that's criminal and a felonious charge, you should also be tried for murder when someone is murdered. So I think the Justice Department is busy at their work. I don't know what the outcome is, but if we're using Garland's thinking, then we have to believe that these are the easy trials that we're seeing right now. The long and hard ones are to come still, as he led us to believe in his speech earlier.
CK, the House committee, they have their own investigation going, which seems to be ramping up as they issue a bunch of subpoenas. But I don't think people take their investigation seriously, because their motivation for looking into the riot could be seen as politically driven. But why is it important that they stay the course and get to the truth of what happened on January 6th?
It's critically important. The Justice Department is its own separate entity, and they're pursuing through the courts. But it's critically important that our lawmakers of that very Capitol that was stormed take matters into their hands, use the powers that they have to hold people accountable. It's very important, because one way or another, there should be accountability at the top. So the Justice Department has its course, U.S. Congress has its course, and then the people of this country also need to look and see what happened, because we've got midterm elections. And I think that people can speak loudly and clearly about what's going on, what happened during the attempted coup d'etat, and it should be reflected in their vote. So I think that there are many, many ways that these investigations can take place on many levels. A number of people, over 700 people, have been arrested. We've seen that there are a number of trials going on. It's a process indeed, but I just think people are anxious to see some of the bigger dogs, if you will, in the fight being held accountable, and all of the obfuscation and ignoring subpoenas that we're seeing of people who were involved. At some point, that's got to stop. So I think that Congress needs to do what it needs to do. And I hope that they continue to do this very aggressively. Based on people at the helm, I know it's going to happen. I know it's going to happen.
So where do we go from here? Mondale, we can prosecute hundreds more who had anything to do with the attack on our Capitol, but at the end of the day, you said it earlier, the rot essentially goes deeper. It was just played out on full display on January 6th. So how do we keep history from repeating itself?
I don't think we can. I think these white supremacists that believe the big lie, those that voted for Trump because of them, of the fear of losing something or not being the majority, not just in number, but in power in this country, will continue to move in that manner. They will continue to use race to organize and build fear. And the Republican Party has a role in that. But I think as the majority, again, I believe the majority of Americans are those who unelected Donald Trump. I don't say elected Biden, I say unelected Donald Trump. And because I believe that people were voting against something that they really did abhor. That was that creature, again, that we call Donald Trump. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind, because a lot of the time we put power in personalities and parties, but in actuality, people are voting their values and also voting for issues. And I believe, especially as it pertains to Black men, I know this to be fact because of the work that we do. Black men got out and voted not particularly for Joe Biden, but because of what is possible under a Biden administration. So I think what is to come, or what we can hope for, is that people, like-minded people, progressive thinking people who believe that there's a different America that allows space for everybody to be whole and respected, will continue to win in the long haul. And this is not just some pie in the sky type of thinking. This is what we've seen over the results of the past few elections. If you look at what happened in 2018, 2020, and then again in 2021, how people respond to candidates when they're speaking to their issue.